All right, so get ready because today we are diving deep, deep into the life of George W. Bush.
Let's be good.
Yeah, and you sent over some excerpts from his biography, and let me tell you, this family history, it's wild.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about George W. Bush, a biography written by Clark Roundtree. It was published back in 2011. And I think this deep dive is going to be like a crash course on how the whole Bush dynasty and a little bit of that Texas flair shaped a president.
Well, I think it goes even deeper than just like a political story, right?
Right.
We're looking at how someone becomes a leader,
Yeah.
how their values are shaped by all the generations that came before them,
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back to Prescott Bush.
Okay.
This is George W.'s grandfather.
Right.
And this guy is like the textbook definition of an American dynasty. We're talking skull and bones at Yale. Successful businessman. He even became a senator. But here's where it gets interesting. There's this whole story about him getting caught in a war decoration hoax.
A hoax. What do you mean?
So apparently he wrote a letter kind of joking about saving all these famous generals' lives.
Oh.
And then somehow newspapers printed it as fact. He was getting medals for all this stuff that he didn't actually do.
Oh, that's a bit awkward. So what happened?
Well, his mother had to write to the newspaper to set the record straight.
Oh, wow. That must have been a little embarrassing for him.
Oh, yeah. But, it also kind of speaks to this playfulness, but also the influence of these institutions, right? Like
Yeah.
Yale and Skull and Bones. I mean, these networks, they had a huge impact on how Prescott saw the world.
For sure. Those kinds of connections can really shape your outlook.
But wait,
Uh-oh. What else?
that's only half the story because we got to talk about Dorothy Walker.
Oh, right. George W.'s mother.
Exactly. And she also came from a pretty powerful family. Oh, yeah. Her father, Burt Walker, he founded the Walker Cup in golf.
Wow, the Walker Cup. That's huge in the golfing world.
Exactly. And he was even connected to the New York Mets.
So both sides of the family were pretty high-powered. Interesting.
It's like a pattern, right? You've got the Bushes, you've got the Walkers, and they both have wealth. They're committed to public service. And this love of sports, it's a potent mix.
Absolutely. And that mix definitely influenced the world that George W. was born into.
Oh, for sure. And then, of course, you've got Poppy, George H.W. Bush.
Poppy, yeah. I like that nickname.
And it's like he follows this textbook Bush trajectory, right?
Laid on me.
Andover, war hero pilot in World War II, back to Yale, and then he decides to go into the oil business in Texas.
So he's got the pedigree, the war hero status, and then he jumps into Texas oil.
Oh.
What a life.
Oh, yeah. And, we can't forget about his crazy wartime experience. I mean, he was shot down twice over the Pacific.
Wow.
Rescued at sea. There's actually footage of his rescue that they showed at the 1988 Republican National Convention.
No way.
Yeah.
Talk about a campaign ad, right?
I know. And then there's this whole love story. He met Barbara at a Christmas dance. Got engaged before being deployed.
Romantic.
I know, right? And they got married after the war.
A true Hollywood story. Well, almost.
What do you mean?
It's important to remember they went through a lot of hardship, too. They lost their daughter, Robin, to leukemia when she was very young.
Mm-hmm.
That must have had a profound impact on young George and the whole family.
Absolutely. And then we've got little George W. growing up in Midland, Texas.
Oil country.
Oh, yeah, which was booming with the oil business. And, that's a world away from his parents' Northeastern upbringing.
Yeah, it's a different world, that's for sure. What was it like for them there?
Well, Midland was kind of this fascinating mix. You had families like the Bushes who were drawn by the opportunity, right?
Right.
Kind of creating this little yuppie land west, as Poppy called it.
Yuppie Land West. I love that.
I know. But then nearby you had Odessa, which was this rough and tumble town for all the oil workers. So it was like two very different sides of the boom.
Interesting. So how did George W. take to this new environment?
Well, he seemed to soak up that Texan spirit, Like, Little League Baseball was his thing.
Of course, baseball's huge in Texas. Plus, remember his family connection to the Mets through his great-uncle?
It's like it was all coming full circle.
It's like destiny.
Yeah.
But wait a minute. Didn't Poppy have some political aspirations around this time?
That's right. He decided to run for Congress in Texas.
Okay, but Texas is a different kind of political landscape than back east.
Oh, completely. It meant appealing to a more conservative base.
So he had to become a Texan Republican, not just a Republican.
Exactly. And, you have to wonder, how much did that influence George W.'s own political path later on? It had to have some effect. Now fast forward, and we've got young George at Phillips Academy.
Handover. Poppy's old stomping grounds.
Talk about legacy. But Poppy was a star athlete, George W. He found his own way.
Oh, yeah. How so?
He wasn't the best student, but guess what? He became head cheerleader. I can just imagine Barbara out there cheering with him.
That is such a great visual. Shows that Bush family support, even if things weren't always easy.
Yeah. And he started a stickball league. They called it Twin. Quit.
So he was the life of the party, huh?
Sounds like it. But then it's off to Yale, following in Poppy's footsteps again. And this is where things get a little more complicated.
How so?
Well, he was actually engaged to this woman named Kathy Lee Wilfman, but it ended before they got married. Even with this seemingly perfect life laid out for him, there were bumps in the road.
Yeah, life rarely goes according to plan. But there's one more thing we have to talk about from this period.
Oh, yeah. The elephant in the room.
His service in the Texas Air National Guard during Vietnam.
Yeah, that was controversial, to say the least.
To put it mildly, what does the biography have to say about that?
Well, there are some gaps in the record. A transfer to Alabama, questions about whether he actually fulfilled his obligations. It's definitely a topic that followed him throughout his political career.
It's complicated, but it does remind us that everyone has their own baggage, and sometimes that baggage is tied to family history or choices made when you're younger. It shapes who you become, for better or worse.
No doubt about it. And speaking of choices, George W. had kind of a period of searching after Yale. Harvard Business School is a far cry from struggling with grades earlier on.
You're telling me. So what happened after he graduated? Did he just jump into politics?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. He tried a few different paths. Worked in the oil business for a while. And get this, he even tried his hand at a social program called Project PUL in Houston's inner city.
Wow. Social work. That's not what you'd expect.
Right. It's like he was figuring out where he fit in, testing the waters. And it was actually during this time that he met Laura Welch, who would become his wife.
Oh, so the future first lady enters the picture.
Yeah.
And their courtship was a whirlwind. 3 months of dating, and boom, they're married.
Talk about a power couple in the making. So we've got George W. He's settled down. He's married, tried out a few different careers. And then comes what seems like a turning point.
What that?
His involvement with the Texas Rangers baseball team.
Oh, yeah. But this was more than just a hobby, right?
Way more. He became the managing general partner. That's a leadership position. And remember, he was instrumental in getting that new ballpark built. But to do that, he had to convince people to raise sales taxes.
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one. Got to win over the voters.
Talk about a political tightrope walk. So maybe those political instincts were there all along, just waiting for the right moment.
And pretty soon he takes the leap and decides to run for governor of Texas.
From baseball to the governor's mansion, that's quite a jump.
What a story, right?
So tell me, how'd he campaign? Was it your typical Texas Republican style? Well, here's the thing. He ran as a compassionate conservative. And that was pretty unique at the time. It wasn't just about those traditional Republican values. He really focused on education reform. Even pushed for phonics-based reading instruction, which was controversial back then.
Interesting approach. So did it work?
It did. He won, and not just once. He became the first Texas governor to be elected to 2 4-year terms back-to-back.
Wow, 2 terms. That's impressive. But I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing.
You're right. There was this jury duty incident that brought up questions about a possible pass drunk driving charge. And those battles with the legislature over tax cuts, those were tough.
Sounds like it. But overall, he was considered a successful governor, right?
Oh, yeah. But then hold on tight, because here comes the big leagues, the 2000 presidential election.
Oh, boy. That was a nail-biter. I remember watching the returns, and it was like nobody knew who was going to win.
The biography captures that tension perfectly. It was incredibly close, contested all the way against Al Gore. And then it all comes down to Florida and that infamous recount.
And then, bam, the Supreme Court steps in.
Bush v. Gore.
A landmark decision.
Yeah.
I mean, it basically handed the presidency to Bush.
It's crazy. The book even describes this thing called the Brooks Brothers riot.
The Brooks Brothers riot. What's that?
So basically, all these Republican staffers flew into Florida to protest the recount. It just shows how intense things were at the time.
Wild. So George W. Bush, former cheerleader, Texas governor, suddenly finds himself as the president of the United States. I bet that was a surreal moment.
I can't even imagine. And he jumped right into pushing a conservative agenda. Abortion, stem cell research, environmental regulations. He tackled all the hot button issues.
It sounds like he had a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish.
He definitely did. And he established the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives.
Wait, what's that?
It basically channeled government grants to religious organizations for social services.
Wow, that's a big one. Talk about reigniting the debate on the separation of church and state.
For sure. And let's not forget the tax cuts. He was all about supply-side economics, following in Reagan's footsteps, slashed those taxes, arguing it would boost the economy, even with the dot-com bubble bursting right then.
It's remarkable how much his economic philosophy seemed to be shaped by Reagan. But then, of course, the world changed forever September 11th, 2001. Everything was different after that.
You're right. It's a turning point in history.
Yeah.
And the biography does a great job of capturing that human element of that day. Bush was reading to school children in Florida when he got the news.
It's hard to imagine what must have been going through his mind at that moment. A nation in shock. And he's the one who has to lead them through
It's
it.
heavy stuff. And the book actually mentions this really chilling detail.
What's that?
His chief of staff, Andy Card, whispers, "America is under attack."
Wow.
But Bush kept reading to the kids for another 5 to 7 minutes.
5 to 7 minutes. That's incredible.
Yeah.
What do you think was going through his mind?
I have no idea, but it's such a powerful image. And then, of course, you've got that iconic image of him on the USS Abraham Lincoln delivering the mission accomplished speech.
So much symbolism in that moment.
Yeah.
But it also became a source of criticism as the war dragged on, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the biography really delves into all the complexities of the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, the justification they used WMD's, Saddam Hussein's supposed ties to terrorism well. Those turned out to be shaky at best.
And then there's the chaos of post-invasion Iraq, the looting, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, the rise of the insurgency. What a mess.
Yeah, it was really rough. And the book talks about this concept called the Bush bubble.
The Bush bubble, what is that?
It's this idea that he had a tendency to delegate and maybe not ask those tough questions, which may have led to some bad decisions.
It raises such a big question, though. How much responsibility does a leader have for their administration's actions, especially in a time of crisis? That's something historians are still debating when it comes to George W. Bush's presidency.
It's a really complex issue. And, his second term was definitely full of curveballs. Growing opposition to the Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina devastating the Gulf Coast, the beginning of the economic crisis. It was a trial by fire, that's for sure.
It sounds like it. I can't imagine the pressure he must have been under.
There's this one anecdote in the book that really stood out to me.
Oh.
Bush is at a press conference, and he's asked about his biggest mistake.
Yeah.
He couldn't name one. It just makes you think about his leadership style, his perception of himself.
It's a fascinating insight into his personality. So after the surge and all the challenges of his second term, what happened next? What does the book say about his post-presidency?
Well, it definitely seems more low-key compared to his time in office. He wrote his memoir, he does some speaking engagements, there's the presidential library at SMU.
Right, those are pretty standard post-presidency activities.
But then there's this one detail that really surprised me.
What's that?
He's taken up painting.
Painting. Seriously, that's unexpected.
I know, right? It's like he's found a new way to express himself after all the intensity of the presidency. But the biography still offers these intriguing glimpses into his character. Like, it talks about his unwavering loyalty to his staff, even when they messed up.
That's interesting. I mean, loyalty is a good quality, but does the book explore whether that loyalty ever became a problem for him?
It does make you wonder, right? Was it a strength or a weakness? Did it sometimes prevent him from holding people accountable, from making those tough decisions? It's a really thought-provoking question.
It is. And, it all circles back to that whole Bush bubble idea we discussed. Was he really isolated from those who disagreed with him? Or did he simply choose to surround himself with people who reinforce his own beliefs? It's a question that's worth pondering.
It really is. And, it's just amazing to think about all the twists and turns in George W. Bush's life. From family dynasty to wartime president, his story is full of surprises. What stands out to you? What surprised you the most?
I think it's fascinating how this Bush bubble narrative still follows him even now. Is it a fair assessment? Or does it overshadow some of his genuine achievements? Like, think about his efforts to combat AIDS in Africa. That was a huge initiative that saved millions of lives.
That's such a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the controversies and headlines. But there's always more to the story. There's always more to discover.
Exactly. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. We get to peel back the layers, see the complexities, and ultimately come to our own conclusions.
So if you're listening and you're as intrigued as we are, I highly recommend checking out the full biography. And the George W. Bush Presidential Center website, it's a goldmine of information. There's so much more to explore about this complex and fascinating figure.
I completely agree. There's a whole world of information out there waiting to be discovered. It's kind of interesting looking back at his college years, you know? Almost seems like a turning point for him around that time. Maybe going to Harvard Business School gave him, like, I don't know, a new focus, especially compared to, his earlier struggles in school.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, right?
Yeah.
If he felt that pressure to live up to the Bush name, the legacy, and all of that. But even with all that, he didn't just take that straight and narrow path after graduation.
What did he do?
He explored different things, worked in oil for a bit, even tried his hand at social work with this program called Project PUL in Houston's inner city.
Social work. That's not exactly what you'd expect.
I know. It's like he was trying to figure out, like, where he fit in.
Yeah.
Testing the waters,
Testing the waters, yeah.
And it was actually during this time that he met Laura Welch, who would later become his wife.
Ah, so the future First Lady enters the picture.
Exactly. And their courtship. Total whirlwind, 3 months of dating, and bam, married.
Wow, 3 months. That's fast.
Yeah.
I guess it just goes to show those whirlwind romances, sometimes they work out.
They do. And, they seem to have built a very solid partnership.
Yeah, they do.
Okay. So now we've got George W. He's married. He's dabbled in a couple careers. And then comes this, I guess you'd call it a major shift.
What's that?
His involvement with the Texas Rangers baseball team.
Baseball. But this was more than just, a rich guy buying a team, right?
Oh, yeah. This was way more than that. He actually became managing general partner.
Okay, so a leadership position.
Exactly. And remember, he was a key player in getting that new ballpark built. But to do that, he had to convince people to raise sales taxes.
Ah, that's a tough sell.
Yeah.
Convincing voters to raise their own taxes, that takes serious skill.
It does. You've got to win over the voters.
Totally. So maybe those political instincts, maybe they were always there, just waiting for the right moment.
Yeah. Maybe so. And pretty soon, he takes the leap and decides to run for governor of Texas.
Wow, from baseball to the governor's mansion. That is a jump.
I know. What a story. So how do you think he campaigned? Was it like typical Texas Republican style?
Well, actually, no. What's fascinating is he campaigned as a compassionate conservative.
Compassionate conservative. That's interesting.
It was pretty unique at the time. It wasn't just about, like, those traditional Republican values, He really emphasized things like education reform, even pushed for phonics-based reading instruction, which was a controversial topic.
Did it work?
It did. He won, and not just once, but twice. He actually became the first Texas governor to be elected to 2 4-year terms, back-to-back.
Wow, 2 terms. That's impressive. But I'm guessing it wasn't always, easy.
Of course not.
There were definitely some bumps along the way.
Yeah, like what?
Well, there was this jury duty thing that happened. Raised questions about a possible DWI in his past.
Oh, yeah. I remember hearing about that.
And those battles over tax cuts with the legislature, those couldn't have been fun.
Sounds pretty stressful.
It was. But overall, most people considered him a successful governor.
Yeah, I'd say so. But then, get ready, because here comes the big show, the 2000 presidential election.
Oh, yeah. I still remember watching the returns. I mean, nobody knew who was going to win.
It was a nail-biter. The biography really captures that tension well. I mean, that race against Al Gore, it was so close.
Neck and neck. Went down to the wire, and then, of course, it all came down to Florida.
Florida and that crazy recount, it was like hanging on by a thread.
And then, bam, the Supreme Court steps in. Bush v. Gore.
Bush v. Gore. That was a landmark decision.
It was, and it pretty much handed the presidency over to Bush.
I bet there were jaws dropping all across the country.
I know, and the book even describes this scene. They called it the Brooks Brothers Riot.
The Brooks Brothers Riot. That sounds intense. What was that?
Basically, all these Republican staffers flew into Florida to protest the recount.
Wow. They flew in just to protest. That's commitment. It really shows you how intense things were.
Imagine it, George W. Bush, former cheerleader, Texas governor, and all of a sudden he's the president of the United States. That must have been a surreal moment.
Oh, absolutely. So what happened next? How did he handle being president?
Well, he wasted no time. He jumped right into pushing a conservative agenda.
Like what kinds of things?
We're talking abortion, stem cell research, environmental regulations. He tackled all the big hot-button issues.
So he had a very clear vision. Interesting.
He did, and he established this thing called the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives.
Faith-based, what was that about?
It basically allowed the government to give grants to religious organizations for social services.
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Talk about reigniting the debate on the separation of church and state.
You said it. And let's not forget about those tax cuts. He was all about supply-side economics, following in Reagan's footsteps. Slash those taxes big time, saying it would boost the economy, even with the whole dot-com bubble bursting thing happening right then.
It's pretty amazing, actually, how much Reagan seemed to have shaped his economic thinking.
Yeah.
But then, of course, everything changes.
Right.
September 11th, 2001.
The world shifted on its axis.
It did. I mean, everything was different after that.
The biography actually does a really great job of capturing that, human element of that day. You can almost picture it. Bush is reading to these school children in Florida, and all of a sudden, he gets the news.
Yeah, that must have been such a heavy moment.
I mean, a whole nation in shock, and he's the one who has to lead them through it. It's heavy stuff. And there's actually this one really chilling detail in the book.
Oh.
So his chief of staff, Andy Card, he whispers to him, "America is under attack."
Wow.
But Bush, he keeps reading to the kids for another 5 to 7 minutes.
He kept reading.
He kept reading for 5 to 7 minutes.
Wow. I can't imagine what must have been going through his head at that moment. What an incredible detail.
I know. And then, of course, you have that iconic image of Bush on the USS Abraham Lincoln delivering his mission accomplished speech.
So much symbolism packed into that moment.
Yeah.
But it also became a major source of criticism later on, didn't it?
As the war dragged on, oh yeah. And the biography really goes deep into the whole complexities of the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq, all those justifications that they used, WMD's, Saddam Hussein's supposed ties to terrorism. Well, it turned out they were pretty flawed.
And then, you had the reality of what actually happened in post-invasion Iraq. You had all the looting, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, the insurgency gaining strength. It was total chaos.
It was. Really rough. And the book actually talks about this idea of the Bush bubble. Have you heard of that?
The Bush bubble? No, I haven't. What's that?
It's basically this idea that he had a tendency to delegate, maybe not ask those tough questions, and that might have contributed to some, bad decisions.
It raises an important question, though. How much responsibility does a leader have for their administration's actions, especially during a time of crisis? And that's a big one. And it's something that historians are still debating even now when it comes to, George W. Bush's presidency.
It's really a complex issue. And, his second term, it was a trial by fire. Growing opposition to the Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina devastating the Gulf Coast, the start of the economic crisis, one challenge after another.
Wow, he really had his work cut out for him.
He did. And there's this one anecdote in the book that's pretty revealing. So Bush is at a press conference, and he's asked about his biggest mistake.
Oh, I bet that was a tough question. What did he say?
He couldn't name one? It just makes you think, right?
It really does. About his leadership style, his perception of himself. Fascinating.
And then you have the surge in Iraq. Seemed like it was working at first, but then the war just kept dragging on.
Yeah, that was a long and controversial chapter for sure. So where do things go from there? How does the book handle his legacy?
Well, it's still really up for debate.
Yeah, I could see that.
The war on terror, the Iraq war, the economic crisis, those are massive events. I mean, they're going to define his presidency for decades to come. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how history ultimately judges him.
Yeah, me too.
It does feel like, though, his post-presidency has been more low-key, more reflective, maybe. He wrote his memoir. He does speaking engagements here and there. There's the Presidential Library at SMU.
Yeah, all pretty standard post-presidency activities.
But then there's this one detail that totally surprised me.
Oh, what's that?
He's become a painter.
A painter? Wow, that's not what I expected.
I know. It's almost as if he's rediscovering himself after all the pressure of the presidency.
Yeah, I can see that.
But the biography still offers these interesting little glimpses into his character. It talks about his unwavering loyalty to his staff, even when they made mistakes.
Loyalty. It's a great quality, but I do wonder if it ever became a liability for him.
You're right. Makes you think, right? Was it a strength or a weakness? Did it maybe sometimes prevent him from holding people accountable or making those tough calls.
Yeah,
Ooh,
that's the
yeah.
million-dollar question. And, it kind of ties back to that whole Bush bubble concept. Was he really that isolated from people who disagreed with him? Or did he just choose to surround himself with people who, affirmed his beliefs?
It's something to think about for sure. Wow, what a whirlwind. I mean, from family dynasty to wartime president, George W. Bush's life is full of these twists and turns.
Yeah, just
What stood out to you? What surprised you the most?
You know, I think it's fascinating how that Bush bubble narrative still follows him around. I mean, is that really a fair assessment? Or does it kind of overshadow some of the good things he did? Think about his work combating AIDS in Africa. That was a huge deal, saved millions of lives.
That's a great point. It's so easy to just focus on the controversies, the headlines, but, there's always more to the story.
Absolutely. There's always more to discover.
And that's what makes these deep dive so great, right? We get to go beyond the surface, see the complexities, and ultimately, come to our own conclusions.
Exactly.
So if you're listening and this has, sparked your curiosity, I highly recommend checking out the full biography.
Hmm.
And the George W. Bush Presidential Center website is a treasure trove of information. There's so much more to learn about this guy.
Totally. A whole world of information waiting to be discovered.
It's interesting how he seems to have just like embraced this whole new chapter of his life.
Yeah.
The book mentions the memoir, of course, but there's the speaking engagements, the presidential library at SMU, and then there's the painting. It's like he's found this like whole new way to express himself.
It makes you wonder if there's almost like a sense of relief stepping away from all that pressure of the presidency,
Oh, totally.
And yet, even in this quieter phase of his life, you still get these fascinating little glimpses into his personality.
Right.
Like the book talks about his unwavering loyalty to his staff,
Yeah.
even when they messed up.
Yeah, that really stands out, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you think, was it a good thing? Or was it sometimes a problem?
Why? Like, was it a strength or a weakness?
No.
Did it sometimes prevent him from making those hard choices,
Ugh.
holding people accountable?
Those are tough questions.
Tough questions. And it all kind of goes back to that Bush bubble idea, right?
It does. It makes you wonder, was he really shielded from those opposing viewpoints?
Mm-hmm.
Or did he just choose to surround himself with people who, already agreed with him?
It's fascinating. So after diving into all this, what's your big takeaway? How would you even begin to sum up like George W. Bush's legacy?
Oh, man. It's complicated. And it's still evolving, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't ignore the impact of 9/11 and the war on terror. That shaped everything.
Yeah.
And then there's Iraq, the economic crisis.
Yeah.
Those are huge events that we're going to be debating for years to come.
He was definitely a president who led during some really challenging times.
He was.
But it's also interesting to consider those parts of his life that don't always make the headlines, right?
Totally.
His personal relationships, how he grew as a leader, that unexpected artistic side.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about these kinds of deep dives. We get to explore not just the big events, but all those little nuances, the contradictions,
Yeah.
the things that make a person who they are.
I totally agree. So to everyone listening, if you're feeling intrigued, want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out the full biography and the George W. Bush Presidential Center website. Oh, it's a goldmine. You could get lost in all that information.
It's incredible. There's just so much to discover about this man, his presidency, the era he lived in. It's a fascinating journey, and I hope this deep dive has given you a good place to start.
Well, that was a whirlwind. From family dynasty to wartime president, painter, George W. Bush's life is full of surprises. What stands out to you? What surprised you the most?
It's interesting how that Bush bubble narrative still kind of lingers, even now. Is that a fair assessment, or does it overshadow some of the genuinely good things he accomplished? Like, remember his efforts to combat AIDS in Africa. That was a huge initiative that saved millions of lives.
It's easy to get caught up in the controversies, the headlines, but, there's always more to the story. There's always more to discover. That's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. We get to peel back the layers, see the complexities, and come to our own conclusions. So if you're listening and this has piqued your curiosity, I highly recommend checking out the full biography and the George W. Bush Presidential Center website. That's a goldmine of information. There's so much more to learn about this guy.